We are surrounded by such talented people, are we not? You're like, where did you guys buy that? Well, no, it's just the people who make up our community happen to have a little bit of talent. Last series, if you were here for last series, the intro music was more of a slow dance number. And so we requested a little more rocky theme. And so we're getting close to being there. Such a huge day for us at Epic. You've been informed of a number of things, so I just want to keep that going. Tomorrow, February 13th, our church celebrates its 6th birthday. Yeah. And I think we would all say, whether today's your first day, for sure you might say this, or if you've been here since day one, God has far exceeded our wildest imagination and expectations in terms of what we are even hoping that He would do over these 6 years. And it's crazy just to reflect and remember on what it was like when this started, what the thoughts were. And we thought we had huge faith and really bold prayers, and to our limited minds, we did. And God has He's so blown that out of the water, what He's done. I mean, now, 6 years in, 600 people around that many showing up every single Sunday here at Epic, over 3 gatherings at 9 and 10:30 and noon. Our community is represented by people from over 50 nations. We are young and we're old, and every facet of that demographic is growing. So there are more young adults coming in. There are more people who are what we call empty nesters, whose kids have grown up. They want to do the fun, crazy adventure later in life, and so they're moving to the city and trying to live in downtown or somewhere else, and they're part of this church. Families have grown. We actually, last Sunday, we had 10 middle school and high school students in downtown San Francisco, which is massive for us. 2 weeks ago, we had over 90 kids and students here on a Sunday in downtown San Francisco. And so when we think about the community that God has built over a relatively short amount of time, it is just stunning to us. And if you've been a part of that for 6 years, or for 3 years, or for 6 months, or just today's your first day, we're thrilled that you're here. Blown away with what God's done so far, with the community impact that I just mentioned, and then the missional impact. And just so you know, I know there's a lot of startup world stuff happening around these parts. We were a startup church. It was only 6 years ago when we were the ones seeking partnerships. It was just 6 years ago when we were traveling and calling and emailing people, hey, we're going to try to get this new church off the ground in downtown San Francisco. Will you help us? That was who we were 6 years ago. 6 years later, though, we're the ones going, hey, we want to help hold you up as you do your ministry. We want to support in our city and around the U.S. and around the world. So much so that we went from being the ones seeking partnership so people would help us 6 years ago. 6 years later, this church has given over $678,000 to partners in our city, our nation, around the world. And if you don't understand that transition, from going from begging for money to saying, hey, here's $10,000 to help your church get started, and here's $20,000, we're going to help your school make a difference for students that aren't able to buy the normal things that are being bought at most schools. If you don't think that's a massive deal, it's huge. And here's what's crazy. An amazing 6-year history as we look back. But we believe in this season that God is prepared to do more than He's done in the previous 6 years. And we're not taking that for granted. We are not going, God, do you owe us? He's never owed us. We didn't know anything that God would do. He didn't promise to find us a space. He didn't promise to have a staff here. He didn't promise that any of you would come. He just said, I want you to go. And when we said yes, then He began to load up the blessing on the other side of the yes. And one of the things we're going to learn in this series that we're kicking off today is that there's a yes required of us before we know all the details and how something's going to end. You've got to say yes before you know exactly what the job's going to be like. You have to say yes before you know what this new city's going to be like. You have to say yes before you know what it's going to be like to serve in this community or somewhere else around the world. Each of us has a desire to know and to take hold of the reason for our existence. I don't know anyone on the planet. That's what makes this series such a great invitational series, for you to invite those in your lives, in your neighbors, in your neighborhood, wherever, coworkers, friends, whatever. Every one of us on planet Earth, I think, wants to know, what is my life supposed to be about? And we want to take hold of that. We long for a moment or an experience where we can walk away from that moment or experience going, I don't know everything about my future, but I know that I was made for this. Isn't that what we want? And until that moment of clarity comes, we're just left with questions, aren't we? And we love lacking clarity, don't we? I don't know if you're like me, but I'm just like, God, if you will just give me clarity, I'm pretty sure I'll do it. but he wants me to trust him today. He doesn't want me to trust him for what's 100 steps ahead. He wants me to take today's step, and he will orchestrate those next 99 steps over the course of my life. And what we want to do is use the story of Esther in the scriptures to learn a lot about the why behind our lives. So if you have a Bible, we're in Esther. If you need one, just raise your hand. We will get one to you. Esther's in the Old Testament, so first half of the Bible. Esther comes after Nehemiah, before Job. It's also before Psalms. And Esther's where we'll be in just a moment, but I want to set up her story. If you know anything about Esther's story, I want you to forget what you know. Because here's what happens when it comes to Esther's story or several other stories that we're familiar with. We only think about people's lives who had great purpose. We only think about their purpose in its final revealed form, right? And we compare our purpose or lack of purpose to someone else's final purpose. Would you agree with me? So like a few thoughts. Abraham Lincoln, what was his purpose? What did he do? What is he known for? He freed the slaves. He was our 16th president. He's known as one of the greatest presidents in our history. But that's not where his purpose was all along the way. He had failed attempt after failed attempt of political office. When you think about Moses in the Old Testament, we think about him being the leader who went to Pharaoh and freed a couple million Israelites from their slavery under Pharaoh. That's who we think of. But that's his final, revealed purpose. We forget that he was the one who had his mom put him in a basket so that the first Pharaoh wouldn't kill him. When we think about Esther, we may know her in-game story, but I want you to approach her story just like you're forced to approach your story. There's a lot we don't know. And what you want to know is, God, what do you ultimately have for me? What does it look like? And I'm there with you. I want to know, what does 10 years from now look like? What does 20 years? Where are my kids going to college? And should I be saving more money? I'm thrilled that City College free thing is coming up. And just tell me. Just tell me everything to know. And God's like, Ben, that's only for me. And so what I want you to do as we lean into Esther's story is not compare your current story to her final story, but just to look at her story as it unfolds and to begin to understand some of the why behind your life. But Esther's story and all of our favorite stories of heroes in history who had great purpose in the scriptures, even in the present world, here's what they have in common with our story. Here's what they have in common with our story. There is a divine setup taking place for what God intends to pull off in our lives. There is a divine setup taking place for what God intends to pull off in our lives. How many of you, when you get some time or over the holidays, you do some binge watching when it comes to series on television? Nobody's making fun of you, just be honest. All right, do you know those episodes? Because your time is so precious, that's why you're spending 16 hours a week watching the same show. But here's what happens when you and I watch an episode and it's just a setup episode, we're like, that was a waste of my time. Anybody? Nothing got accomplished. But then in the very next episode, you get the aha moment. If you're like me, I want my life to be filled with aha moments, but most of my life and your life is simply filled with setups. A year ago, we were celebrating 5 years as a church. And I'm like, oh, it's a little melodramatic to have your 6th birthday as a church. Right? It's not quite as cool. I mean, we've got cupcakes for you out there, so don't miss out on that. But it's 6. There's nothing special about 6. Guess we have to wait till 10 to have something special. But most of life is a setup. And I don't mean we're being set up for something cruel. I mean that God is positioning things and he's orchestrating things so that he might have us step into what he's created us for. And so quit comparing your current understanding of your purpose with someone else's final or revealed purpose, because you don't know it yet. We look back at what happened over these first 6 years of our church, and if we think we have, any of us, including the pastor, if we think we know everything that God's going to do in the next 6 years, foolish. I have no idea, but what we do know is that God will use everything from the first 6 to set up what he wants to do in the next 6 and the next 60, Lord willing. Does that make sense? And so we just want to pay attention to what God is up to. And here's how Esther's story begins. It's around 480 BC. And we're introduced to our story beginning in this way. It's taking place in the Persian Empire, 480 BC. King Xerxes is king, and it's the 3rd year of his reign. Your translation may say Ahasuerus. Xerxes is a little easier to pronounce, so I'm going with that. Same person. Okay? King Xerxes is king, obviously. It's the 3rd year of his reign, and he throws 2 back-to-back banquets lasting a total of 187 days. And the purpose of the banquets for him was that he might show off his wealth, his splendor, and his glory. The idea being that if you have it, you need to make sure everyone knows that you have it, right? I mean, king's not, we're a little bit like that too, aren't we? Right? And so he wants everyone to know what he has. And so a little over 6 months of banquets taking place there consecutively, day after day after day, so that he might show all of that off. Well, the king has way too much to drink. He becomes severely drunk, and there's so many lessons here, but that'll be another sermon. So many lessons here from the king's drunken stupor. And when he becomes drunk, he calls for his wife, Queen Vashti, and he calls for her to come and to basically display her physical beauty for all of the guys at the banquet. And so if you're curious what kind of man this king is, that curiosity has been removed, yes? You know everything that you need to know about who this king is. He doesn't want to just display his wealth and his collections and the artifacts. He wants to display his wife for all of these men. That's who he is. Well, Queen Vashti refuses to come. And the king's like, that's cool. You're like, Ben, we forgot everything we know about the story. We're waiting on you to tell us, did he really say that's cool? He did not say that's cool. He was furious. He was furious because when the king said jump, you said how high. When the king said go, you went. And when the king said to his wife, the Queen Vashti, come, you came. Only she didn't come, which made him furious. So he calls together some experts of the law. By the way, if you're into what's going on across the national landscape at all, anybody? You're going to see so many parallels in Esther's story. I want to tell you that on the front end, just because I'm not going to say it in every individual instance when I tell you about certain people, and you just have to guess, is he talking about it now? And the answer is probably yes. Okay, but I'm not talking. There's no tweet-worthy stuff coming from this pastor's lips. Okay, but there's so many parallels between Esther's story and who the king is and what's going on in our world today. I will simply leave it there. And so the experts in the law, his buddies, say to him, something has to be done with the queen. Here's the thing. If she gets away with disrespecting you, the king, then it's going to be known throughout the entire land. And everyone's going to find out. And when they find that out, every wife, everywhere in the 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, they are all going to disrespect their husbands. And we can't allow this. So she is deposed of. But every king has to have a queen, and now the search begins. And here was the initiative for the search. Representatives were sent throughout all 127 provinces in the Persian Empire to go and find the most beautiful women and then bring them back. They will be given 12 months of beauty treatments. Guys, if you think that your girl takes a long time to get ready, ladies, if your man thinks you take way too long to get ready, just threaten the Esther effect on him. I will show you. And so from now on, he's just going to be like, you are so fast. Like, that's the quickest 2.5 hours of getting ready I've ever seen in my life. Thanks for not pulling the Esther card on me. And then they would come after those 12 months of their beauty treatment, and each of them would get a night to spend with the king, and then they would return to the harem in the morning. And it doesn't take much imagination for us in this room to picture what those evenings might have been like between the king and the prospective queen. And it's in that setting where we first get introduced to Esther. So if you've got a Bible open to Esther, we're going to be in chapter 2. Keep it open throughout the morning, and we'll look at a few different passages of Scripture, beginning with 5 through 7. It's just an introductory remark. But remember, there's a divine setup taking place for what God intends to pull off in our lives. So you may leave this service going, oh, that wasn't the episode I was hoping it would be. But I promise you, it's setting up what God's going to pull off in her life and in your life too. 5 through 7. Now there was in the citadel of Susa, that was where the king reigned from, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, I would go by Esther too, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So there's introductory language, but don't skip over it. Super important stuff happening here. one of the things we learn is that Mordecai's family of ancestry, like many Jewish families from about 100 years prior, they had been taken exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So they had been removed from Jerusalem. And as far as we know, Mordecai's family never went back to Jerusalem before this moment or even after this moment. And so they're exiled. They're not living in their homeland. They're living in a foreign land under foreign rule and reign. And so you can imagine what that might be like. And I know so many people in our church, you're from a different homeland, and obviously you're living here in the U.S., at least at this present time. And so that's what's going on in terms of their heritage. Another piece of their heritage is that unfortunately, Esther had to go through the tragedy of losing her mother and her father at a very young age. And as I can understand it, her and Mordecai were first cousins, so their fathers were brothers, as best I understand it. And Mordecai, being older than her, obviously, he takes her in as his own adopted daughter, which is a pretty noble act for him to do. And all of that, you're like, Ben, that's just detail after detail. Yes, but it's setting the stage for what's going to happen. And then you see something that might strike you as odd. I'm telling you, the Bible's fascinating when you see that Esther had a lovely figure and was beautiful. What is that about? Well, here's what it's about. Remember that the representatives are going throughout all 127 provinces trying to find who? The most beautiful women. Everything I understand on the estimates of how many women this would have been, it would have been somewhere between 400 and well over 1,000 women. It's like a supersized version of The Bachelor. All right? Only there's lots more competition than just a handful of people. It's a lot of folks involved in this. And now some of you are like, Ben, is that what you've been binge watching? No, we do not binge watch The Bachelor at my house. And you don't have to feel guilty if you do. And so Esther's there, and she first wins the favor of Haggai, who is the man responsible for overseeing the entire group of prospective queens. And as she finds favor with him, he gives her 7 attendants to help her out. Ladies, I don't even know what you do with 7 attendants. I mean, I've been watching The Crown, and I don't understand what you do with 7 attendants. Downton, I don't understand. But anyway, she had 7 attendants. And she was also given special food, and she was put in the best location of the harem. And so that's setting the stage for everything that's about to take place. Now, you can imagine what these episodes would be like when the woman would go to see the king. And then here's what happens with Esther, verses 17 and 18. She's gone to see the king and spend her evening with the king. And here's what it says. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So how did Esther win this competition? How did Esther, how could the king even keep up with so many women that Esther would be the one who would win this competition among hundreds and hundreds of other ladies? How did she do this? What caused the king to favor Esther? One of the very peculiar things in the book of Esther is that you will never find the name of God mentioned throughout the 10 chapters of Esther. It's a phenomenon, so much so that for centuries people have debated and still debate, like, should this even be in the Bible? But while you won't see the name of God mentioned anywhere in Esther's story, you will see the hand of God and the fingerprints of God all over her story. And there's a verse that speaks to exactly why she found favor with the king. It's a verse you need to become familiar with. You're likely to hear it all 5 weeks of this series, and it's telling us everything about why our faith should be strong in God, and it should affect and shape even how we pray and live our lives and what we go for in our lives. It's Proverbs 21:1, which says this. In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels toward all who please him. Let me say it again. You need to become familiar with this. In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that God channels toward all who please him. The image is this. The image is of a farmer who's trying to cause irrigation to bring about maximum results for his crops. And so that farmer would position things in the land, position things in the ground to make the water flow in a certain direction. And what this verse in Proverbs is telling us is that God is like that farmer, And the king's heart is like that stream of water that God is able to direct and to cause and to coordinate in whatever way he wants to. Why is this significant? Well, it's significant in Esther's story because everyone in the Persian Empire thought who had the most power in the universe? The king. The king. And this is true in Moses' life. In Moses' situation, when he goes to Pharaoh, who does everyone, including Moses at first, think has the most power in that land of Egypt? Pharaoh. Right? And you go through all of this. So in Esther's story, it's a literal king. In your story, my assumption is that it's not a literal king, but it could be a president. It could be a government. It could even be a law. It could be your boss. It could be your company. It could even be your very own past. And what you think about that particular thing is that nothing and no one has more power than it does. And what God wants to say right from the beginning, whatever is your proverbial king, whoever it is that you're saying they have the most power, it's the government. It's my boss. It's my ex. It's my past. It's got the most sway over my life. What God wants to step in and say to us from the very beginning of the series is, no, it doesn't have ultimate power. It may have more power than you do, but God might say to you this morning, it doesn't have more power than I do. And we're going to continue to see this element throughout the story because there's no other reason why this little orphan Jewish girl would be the one chosen to be queen. What is this about? And you're like, Ben, I know how the story ends. Remember, we're forgetting that just for today. This is just a setup episode. Okay? We're just thickening the plot a little bit to ask why. Why in the world would she become queen? Now look at verse 19 through 23. This is going to be even more boring to you, but you'll need it later for the 4th or 5th episode. Chapter 2 ends starting in verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued, this says a lot about her and Mordecai's character, she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. Okay, that wouldn't be such a boring episode. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So it seems random, but you'll have to wait in subsequent weeks to see what God was setting up in this moment. But here's what's happening. Mordecai is outside the king's gate. It's where he spent a lot of his time so that he could relay messages to Esther through the servants. And he overhears these two officials plotting their assassination plan for the king. They are going to kill him. Mordecai overhears this. Mordecai tells Esther. Esther tells the king. And it gets recorded in the king's chronicles that Mordecai is the one who foiled the plan. That's all we know for now. We know this so far, that Mordecai's relatives were exiled to the Persian Empire. They were removed from Jerusalem. We know that Esther experienced the tragedy of losing her parents at a young age. We know that Mordecai, her first cousin, took her in as his own daughter. We know that. We know that she was beautiful. We know that the queen Vashti was removed. We know that Esther was one of the prospective queens. She became queen. We know that. We know that Mordecai overhears this plot. But right now, that's all we know. That's the whole point. You know some things about your own story. You know some things about your own history. You know some things about your present position. You know about your past. You know your current struggles. You know your passions. You know your gifts. You know where you live. You know what year it is. You know all of these kinds of things, but there's so many things that you don't know. Would you agree? Even as a church, we know so much that God has done in these past 6 years, but it would be crazy for me to tell you I know everything he's going to do in the next 6 years. I don't know, but I do know that this first 6 years are setting up the next 6. It's not that there isn't an end to self to some degree, but there's always about something more than just what we see on the surface. So we don't know all the things that we wish we knew, but here's what an author once said that I thought was so good. He says, God is up to 10,000 things at any time in our lives, and we may be aware of 3 of them. $10,000 things, and you might have an idea about what 3 of those things are. Why? Because we can't see what God can see. We are confined to time. God is not confined to time. We only know what we see on the surface, but understand this, there's always more purpose than what you see beyond the surface. There's always something deeper happening. There's a passion you have today. You don't even know why you have it, but 36 months from now, God's going to use that passion to bring about something in the world. There's a relational network you're a part of today, and you don't even know why you even know these people's names, but there's going to be a day where somebody's going to say, hey, do you know anyone who's good at this or that? And you're going to go, oh, yeah, I do. There's something happening in your single life that you don't understand, but it's going to make you an amazing husband or wife in the future. There's something God is positioning our church for that we don't yet know that's going to allow us to have a global impact far beyond the amazing first 6 years of our church. We don't know what it is, but it's being positioned right now. And the question we have to ask is, will we believe it on the front end or merely observe it on the back end? Hear this. Seeing that God was at work is an observation. Believing that God is at work when you can't see the results, that is faith. We're great observers, aren't we? We're great at way to go God, and we should be. But what God wants us to do is to trust Him before we can see how He's going to pull whatever He's going to pull off. That's the whole idea. Now, you might say, Ben, why would I trust a God if I don't know how He's going to pull it off? Well, you've got to take inventory and look at His resume. What has He done so far in your life? What has He done so far in history? What has He done so far in our church's community? He's got a track record here, so it's not like there's not someone new applying for the job of being God that it's got no track record. He's got an incredible track record, and the question is, will I look at what He has done up to this point and allow that to fuel my faith, or will I look at the circumstances around me, will I look at the kings around me and go, I don't think this can happen? Philip Yancey, in his book, Disappointment with God, says this: faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. I know you want to know. I'm the same way. In fact, if I'm honest, I'm like you. If there's some way to manipulate a situation so I can know answers, I try to figure it out. I want to know first and then decide if I'm going to move forward. Anybody else? Once I know, let's go. But God's asking me to give Him a yes before He opens up what's next. God asked Shauna and I to say yes to this initiative before we knew we would find a space, before we knew what school our kids would get into, before we knew if any of you would show up, before we knew if a team would say yes. He asked us to say yes, and I didn't know everything, and I still don't know everything that yes means, but I've seen some things, and you've seen some things too, right? And we as a church, we have seen God do some incredible things. And we don't know all the reasons why. Some of you could have never imagined that you would be in a church this morning in downtown San Francisco, even as recent as 3 months ago. But something happened in your life. You wanted to see if this faith thing was real. You had a tragedy. You moved to this city in the last 6 months or 2 years, who knows? And you knew you didn't need to live in isolation, so you showed up. And then you met someone else at Epic from your work. And you're like, I didn't know anybody else at my work went to church. I know how those stories go. In November 2008, I was at a different church. I was teaching through Esther, and here was my whole aim of that series. I wanted to rally that church. There's about the service that I was teaching, 800 to 1,000 people were what it's in. And I wanted to rally that church to go after the big, hard things of God. But I had a pretty good cushion deal right there in the Midwest as a 31-year-old working at a megachurch. This was for everybody else. Hey, I'm going to tell you guys about Esther, and you go do the crazy things. My work here is done. And it was during that teaching series that God began to speak to my heart. Ben, what about you? Where's a metro area that might could use another church? A lot of people would come do what you're doing here in the Midwest. But a lot of people aren't going to those places. So I was like, God, I got to check this with my wife. And about 10 days later, she's like, I'm good with it. She was vying for the East Coast, so had to pull a King Xerxes. Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. She makes every other decision. That's the only one that it's like, but the winters. And for about 50 days, we prayed that God would lead us to where He was wanting us to start this new church in the Bay Area. And then day 50, January 18, 2009, we flew out here. We're going to spend a day in each part of the Bay Area. And I asked God that before those 4 days were up, would you show us where to start this church? That's probably a terrible strategy, but it worked. And the day we were spending in the city, it was just a tourist day because we were never going to be in the city. We were going to be in some place a little more safe, a little more normal. And the last day, we were driving in a minivan. And when you drive a minivan in real life, you don't want to rent a minivan. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the worst experience as a couple who drives a minivan is when we want to go out on a date and the Uber picks us up in a minivan. It's like, we just can't get away from this. What is going on? So we're going to get a tandem bike so we can make it be not minivan. And we're in the minivan and pull over, and I just said, well, guys, where do you think we're supposed to start this church? And I didn't want to persuade anyone, so I just began to listen. And 5 voices, one after another, with a lot of surprise in their voice, a little bit of fear and trepidation, said San Francisco, San Francisco, San Francisco, San Francisco. And then I said San Jose. No, I'm kidding. I did not. I just said this. You're exactly right. And we're a little bit scared to death. But there's no doubt this is what God has for us. And now we get to sit in some of that. And you get to sit in some of that. And our children have been able to witness that for almost 7 years now. But we still believe the best is ahead. And I still believe the best is ahead in your life. Here's what you need to know. Even if you have a lot of question marks over your life right now, God will use your waiting, and he will use your passion, and he will use your gifts, and he will use your job, and he will use your relationships, and he will use your suffering. He will use it all for what it is that he wants to pull off in your life and in the world. And here's what you need to know. Whatever he wants to pull off in your life, it's because he wants to pull it off not only for you, but for others of us. You will never see the story start and stop with you. There's always a greater end. And the question I want to ask you before you have even more clarity is, will you give God your yes and your next step of obedience, not your 100th step? The band's going to come up in a moment and lead us in this song. And it's a song we sang earlier because I think it just fits so well with what we're talking about in this series. And there's this line. It just says, sovereign over every step. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what your king is, but I know this. He, she, it, them, the organization, the country, they don't have more power and authority than God does. And that should increase our confidence, it should increase our prayer life, and it should build our faith in a way that nothing should stop us down. If God is for us, who can be against us? Who are you saying in your heart and mind, it has more power? Some of you have some addictions right now, and you're going, this has more power than God. No, it does not. Some of you are saying, Ben, I work for this Pharaoh-type boss, more power than God. No, he does not. Ben, my visa situation, I feel like God's called me here, but there's a threat that they're going to take my visa away. They've got more power than God. No, they do not. No, they don't. And it's time for us to sync up with one another and go, hey, our God is greater than that, and there's no telling what he will do. I don't know how this will end. I don't know the suffering and struggle and waiting you will go through, but I know that God is up to something. This is what he does. You pray with me. God, I thank you that you're faithful. We're only pieces into the story, God, and already we want to know more. We don't just want to know more about Esther's story, though. God, I want to know more about my story. We at Epic Church want to know more about our story. And God, today you're just saying, hey, hold off. Just trust me today. Pay attention to what I'm doing today. Make yourself available to me today. Trust me on the front end, not just on the back end when you see what did happen. And God, we want to come to you today as a people. God, we're so humbled by what you've done, but also keep us so confident in what you're going to do. God, 10,000 things, and we may be aware of 3 of those. Oh, God, we don't know even what you're doing in the kids' rooms down the hall. God, maybe someone who's going to do amazing things for you is having a vision ignited in their heart right now. God, we don't know what you're going to do in the living rooms this week as we launch this session of Epic Groups, but maybe there will be a relationship ignited. There will be a difference-making partnership in the years to come. God, you've brought us from all over the earth. You've brought us from all kinds of different faith journeys and backgrounds, and we are just saying, make us one. Collectively, make us the kind of people, young and old, black and white, that will lean in together, that will trust you for more than we can see today, but who will take our next step. Because as we say around here, everything you want us to do requires a step of faith, a move of faith. God, we want to trust you on the front end. Before we know our final revealed purpose, we will trust that you have one. And Jesus, we want to lean in under your name. One body under the name of Christ, trusting you for what only you can do, God. There is no king with more power than you have. And we sit in that realization in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand with me as Brenda leads us in this anthem around, God, you're sovereign over everything, and we're alive in you.